All right, folks, today we are going to talk about the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition. I'm going to tell you what all that means, how America expanded west, how it went from an East Coast only country in North America all the way across to the land we have now. And this happened between 1804, it should say 1803, probably really, but 1803 to 1806. So let's start. The year 1800, that's the year Thomas Jefferson was elected president. At that time, remember, we've talked about this before. East Coast, all the 13 original states, right? And we had expanded west some. Northwest Territory, which we talked about a few weeks ago before we went on break. Indiana Territory, right here. So the Mississippi River, remember, that's the dividing line between East and West at the time. And even now to a certain degree. Mississippi River, east of the Mississippi. This was the United States of America back then, not Florida, but this whole part where you see all the colors, United States. Okay, this gray right here, the colony of Louisiana was owned by the French. So this whole big middle part right here, owned by the French. Okay, and that's what the United States wanted to expand west to eventually go all the way out to the West Coast, right? This is what we were looking at, this part. 1803, we wanted to buy this big, huge plot of land. So how did we go about doing that? How did Thomas Jefferson, the president, go about doing that? So under Thomas Jefferson as president, he proposed the Louisiana Purchase, means we're going to literally buy all that land I just showed you from the French and expand America. So America bought from France all of the Louisiana Territory. It was about 827,000 square miles for only $15 million. I know $15 million sounds like a lot. Back then, it was really, really a lot, back in 1803. But it was probably $1 an acre. It was something like that, very cheap for the time. So 827,000 square miles, $15 million. This was the largest territory gain in U.S. history, right? It's still probably up there. Much of this land, of course, was unknown and undiscovered by Europeans. There are some natives who lived there, but we basically didn't know what was out there. We wanted to see what kind of land it was. Could we grow stuff? Could people live on it? And could people survive out there with natives and everything? So that was the idea, to expand and grow the country. And it was all unknown. They had an idea, maybe what was out there, but they wanted to see for sure. So the Louisiana Purchase, this is all of the land that we bought from France. 827,000 square miles, $15 million. And you can see, for frame of reference, this is Oklahoma, right? Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas. So Oklahoma was part of French territory back then, before the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so now we want to explore what's there. The president wants to hire some people to explore what's out there, so we can start saying, hey, how are we going to set up camp? How are we going to set up shop out there, get people living out there, and things like that. So Thomas Jefferson wanted to explore the new United States territory, of course. Jefferson assigned his personal secretary, a guy by the name of Meriwether Lewis, to head the expedition, to go all the way to the West Coast. William Clark, another pretty popular explorer at the time, was then chosen by Lewis to help lead the expedition. These men put together what became known as the Discovery Corps. That was the name of Lewis and Clark's team of men and women who explored all the way out to the West Coast, Louisiana Territory first, and all the way up to Oregon, Washington area on the West Coast. 45 members of the Discovery Corps. Okay, so they started in St. Louis, Missouri. This is their starting point right here. They went across Missouri, just through Kansas a little bit, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota. The yellow line is the outward journey. So that's the road they took to go to the West Coast. Up here through Montana, down here, and then through Idaho, this yellow line, follow the yellow line. Then Washington, Oregon along the Columbia River. The Columbia River is the dividing line between Washington and Oregon. So they were in the Washington side of the Columbia River on the way there. Then on the way back, the homeward journey, as it says here, they came from Oregon, and then they went back along the river, and you just follow the red line. They kind of went basically, they split up at one point. You can see the two different dotted lines. Basically followed the same trail back, except one went north, Lewis and Clark went south. So they split there. They met back up here, right here, North Dakota, and then they followed the old trail back to St. Louis. And this trip took about 2.5 years. So for frame of reference, I like to put a name with a face, and maybe you do too. So that's what Meriwether Lewis looked like, handsome young gentleman, and William Clark. So frame of reference, that's the picture. That's what the guys look like, in case you wanted to put the face with their names. Okay. Sacagawea. Sacagawea was a Shoshone Indian girl. They think she was around only 16 years old at the time. She met and helped guide Lewis and Clark on their expedition. So just imagine that, a 16-year-old helping go all the way across the country like that back then without modern tools, from St. Louis all the way to the West Coast. While camped for winter, because obviously they went through a couple winters, they took 2.5 years. Sacagawea gave birth to her son, helped into labor by a concoction Lewis made of crushed rattlesnake rattles. So remember, this is very primitive medicine. There were no modern hospitals back then in 1800, so this is very primitive and old types of medicine here. Rattlesnake rattles, right? Basically rattlesnake tails. So Sacagawea goes with her husband along with Lewis and Clark. So Sacagawea's husband came along for the trip. She was a young Indian girl, and that's a picture of Sacagawea. So again, putting a face with a name. So we mentioned the rattlesnake rattles. Medicine in the early 1800s was very primitive. So germ theory did not come about until the early 1860s. So they didn't know how diseases spread, what diseases were. So imagine that. There was no vaccinations, not much real medicine to treat things. If you got sick, you were in real trouble. So that could present a problem, right? You're going through harsh winters. You come across dirty water. It's not the most sanitary thing to travel in 1800 all the way to the West Coast from St. Louis, thousands of miles. So, or a few thousand miles at least there and back. So the top physician of the country at the time was a man named Benjamin Rush. And top physician is a relative idea, still very primitive. Rush believed that the best way to cure anything, including mental illness, was to purge the body. So what does purge mean? Methods of purging included bloodletting, which is just bleeding the disease out of your system, or putting leeches on your body. Leeches are little blood-sucking, little like snail or little slugs or something. You put them on your skin and it sucks the blood out. So they thought they'd suck the sickness out of you, or you could bleed it out. Or ingesting mercury. Mercury is it's like a metal, and it's very, very toxic and poisonous. So if you can avoid it, I would say don't ever drink any mercury. They use it right now for thermometers, or they used to use it in thermometers. Now it's hardly used at all with, again, modern medicine. Lewis of Lewis and Clark was trained by Rush before the expedition, so he believed in these types of things. Strangely, almost no one died on the expedition. I think only 1 or 2 people actually died, which is a miracle for back then. Okay, what was the trip actually like? Here's the expedition. What was it like? The men traveled all the way to the West Coast, the Pacific Coast, West Coast, making great discoveries on the way. What did they discover? What kind of new things that we never seen that Lewis and Clark, actually discovered along the way? Remember, all from St. Louis all the way up to the West Coast, Oregon, Washington area. Okay, they took samples of the flora and fauna, plants and animals, and drew detailed maps of where they went. So again, mapping things as you go helps determine what kind of land and how good of land it is. So that helped a lot to the lay of the land, as they call it. So just quickly, we'll sidetrack. Took samples of the plants. What kind of plants did they discover that no one had ever seen before in America? Let's see. So Lewis and Clark, plants, uh, cactus, Missouri foxtail cactus, some flowers. This is Louisia, obviously named after Lewis. So you can see some roots, soapweed. I don't know what that's used for. A new type of fruit, a type of apple, and various things like that. Right? What kind of new animals did they discover on their trip? Animals that no one had ever seen. The bison, that's the big one. Big in Oklahoma, obviously, or it used to be, but the bison is the big one for them. Grizzly bear. No one had ever seen a grizzly bear, and Lewis and Clark discovered the grizzly bear. The beaver, elk. A lot of you have gone elk hunting, or your parents have, or you've heard of it. So elk discovered by Lewis and Clark, right, and a few others. So great discoveries, things, animals that we commonly see today or think of today that no one had ever seen before, and Lewis and Clark discovered. Luckily for them, when they discovered grizzly bears, they weren't eaten or killed by them. So, but now it's just a normal thing to see a bear in the wild or in the zoo. They also encountered 50 native tribes. Most of the tribes were friendly and helpful, giving them food and info and helping them along the way, telling them go this way and not that way, giving them food. They were running out of food. They almost starved to death, the whole crew on the trip at one time. But the Native Americans, the Indian tribes, helped them along, let them pack up with food and go along their way and help them along their way. There was some minor skirmishes, and they ran into some unfriendly natives. I mean, I would be unfriendly too if these strange men, maybe I've never seen a white person before, and the strange men come marching across my land, then I'd be a little suspicious too. So they did encounter some unfriendly Native American tribes. Okay, again, this is just the trip, again, for visual. All these states, all the way a couple thousand miles, all the way out to the West Coast. Boom, we made it, hooray. We see the Pacific Ocean. Now we go all the way back. And it takes 2.5 years with wagons and everything, horses, to make this trip. Okay, the return. I showed you there and back. What was the return like? So the expedition returned to St. Louis 2.5 years later. Everyone thought they were dead. You don't hear from somebody. There was no telephones, no cell phones, no house phones, no texting, emailing. So you don't hear about someone. 2.5 years, you figure, hey, I guess they didn't make it. Maybe the Indians got them. Maybe they died, got diseases and died, or they starved to death. But then all of a sudden, they came back and they were given a hero's welcome. There were many balls, which is like a big party, and celebrations in the towns they traveled through on their way home. Right? So hey, Lewis and Clark, they discovered all this new territory. Let's throw them a big party. Lewis, Meriwether Lewis, was named governor of the Louisiana Territory, and Clark was made the Indian agent for the West. So they were both given big, prominent jobs afterwards. So they were celebrated as national heroes and given good, well-paying government jobs after they returned, which was well deserved, I think. Probably a pretty tough journey. We'll learn a little more about this as we go. Okay, this says, what became of Lewis and Clark? Like, what happened to them? Let me move this down some. Okay, what happened to them? Like, eventually. So William Clark married a woman, Julia, who he loved before his trip and named a river after her during his journey. Unfortunately, in 1809, just what was it? We say 3 years after they returned, Meriwether Lewis commits suicide, and I couldn't figure out why. I'm assuming, and this is just an assumption, educated guess, probably had something to do with him going on that trip. I would imagine, but I couldn't find why he committed suicide. In 1812, so 6 years after the trip, Sacagawea dies, and William Clark, take takes custody of her son Jean Baptiste and daughter Lisette. So Sacagawea, she was only, let me see, 1803, 1804. She was around 16. She was only 24 years old when she died, and Clark took custody of her kids and raised them. And Clark dies of old age in 1838 in the home of his eldest son, Meriwether Lewis Clark. So he named his son after his partner, Meriwether Lewis, right? Clark, the last name. So there you go. There you have it. That's the your introduction to the journey of Lewis and Clark and the Louisiana Purchase by President Thomas Jefferson.